of this series of seminar. Yes, I mean the title of the talk is a little bit provoking, exactly because and I hope that the reason for that title will be clearer during I mean at the end of this of my presentation. So I will start with the classical version of the symbol grounding problem, which is how artificial intelligence system, AI systems that are essentially manipulating symbols that are originally meaningless, and they manipulate these meaningless symbols just on the basis of their formal syntactic properties, then can come to have some internal representations and outputs that possess, on the other hand, intrinsic meaning. So these meanings is in a way independently of the interpretation of the meaning that we can assign to them as humans that interact with them. And we can talk about a form of the symbol grounding problem for language models, exactly because language models are only trained to predict the probability of linguistic forms that for them are meaningless, given a context of other linguistic forms that are for them meaningless, and they are extracted from purely textual data. And so how it's possible that these models that manipulate and that predict symbols probability given other symbols, then can come to attach to these symbols an intrinsic meaning. And this, the version of this of the symbol grounding problem for language models has also been termed by Coelho, Mollo, and Millier the vector grounding problem, exactly because, as you know, these models basically manipulate internal representations that are vectors. What I mean by meaningless linguistic forms that are manipulated by language models? Well, on the one hand, you know, if I take a sentence like this, la ragazza ha dato un libro al ragazzo, well, I can decode this meaning if I know Italian, and I can attach to this sentence the meaning that the girl gave the boy a book. On the other hand, take a series of symbols like that, peta pazza, capato, and ti gatto, which is just a jabberwocky sentence that contains linguistic forms to which I cannot assign any meaning, whatever language I might know, anyway. And let's say that language models are like us in front of the case number 2. So from their intrinsic point of view, they receive an input only a huge amount of sequence of symbols that for them are just meaningless, and that they simply combine and observe how they co-occur together. Of course, one could say that, well, actually, language models, when they manipulate these symbols, they actually form some representations exactly, and these representations come to be attached, come to have meanings, because actually what they do, these models, is that they behave like distributional semantic models, basically. So they basically encode the statistical distributions of linguistic co-occurrence that extracts from textual data into vectors that are also called embeddings. And the so-called distributional hypothesis tells us that since lexemes with similar distributional properties have similar meanings, then also the vectors that encode these statistical distributions will come to have several aspects of the semantics of their argument. So basically, that is exactly the only way, the only tools that these models have in order to turn symbols that are intrinsically meaningless for them into representations, vectors that actually come to encode some aspects of these of meanings, exactly derived from their statistical co-occurrences. Now, the problem is that, so the symbol grounding problem is do word embeddings of these models have intrinsic meanings? And so the problem is, does distributional learning, which is the only tool that these models use, suffice to solve the symbol grounding problem for language models, so to provide them with intrinsic meaning? And of course, these questions come into, can be turned into two major issues. Simply, what do we mean by intrinsic meaning? So what does intrinsic meaning consist of? And what aspects of intrinsic meaning can be learned from distributional data? I've always found a very interesting and convenient a distinction that Diego Marconi theorized in 1997 in its book Lexical Competence, and this is the distinction between inferential and referential semantic competence. And this distinction, and the distinction raised by Diego Marconi is also come back in the current debate about language models, their meanings, and so on. Basically, this distinction amounts to say, well, on the one hand, we have what we can call inferential ability, which is the ability to manage connection among words, which underline performances as a semantic inference, paraphrase, definition, finding synonyms, and so on. So, for instance, it is inferential competence that is made of informations like the fact that an aardvark is a mammal, so hypernonymic or is a relation, so that aardvark has legs, so part of relations, and so on. And this type of relations, which is basically a relations between lexical items, lexical words, between words, is to be, let's say, compared or distinguished from referential competence, which is, on the other hand, is the ability to map lexical items onto the word. So, for instance, going from the symbol aardvark to the actual animal that in the word that we can use this word and that we can refer to with using this word. Now, if we look at this, the current debate on whether large language models, and in particular large language models, do have intrinsic meanings, and so whether they have actually solved or not the symbol grounding problem, you might know that there is one view that I call the skeptical view, which basically says that the language models, and in particular those that are based only on text input, cannot solve the symbol grounding problem and do not have nor can have intrinsic meaning, because meaning cannot spring only from recording statistical associations among linguistic forms. A version of this skeptical view is what we find in the Bender and Kohler paper and their octopus, intelligent octopus argument, which is basically kind of a revisitation or changes of the Chinese room argument, but also in a more recent paper by Titus, in which basically also exposes the similar skeptical position. On the other hand, a contrasting perspective is what we can call the optimistic view, which basically says that language models, even purely textual ones, can solve the symbol grounding problem and do have or can have intrinsic meanings, because actually the statistical associations extracted from linguistic forms can suffice to generate these meanings. And again, some versions of this optimistic view, I think it's pointed out in a paper by Anders Söger in 2022, and is also partially present, I think, in a paper by Coelho Morio and Millier in 2023. What is it basically? I will not go into detail of the skeptical view. I will discuss more exactly the optimistic view of how language models actually can solve or do solve actually for them the symbol grounding problem. Well, I think that the optimistic view is based on three claims, essentially. So the symbol grounding problem primarily concerns referential semantics competence. So what we can call referential grounding or grounding sensu stricto. Actually, Coelho, Moyo, and Millier distinguish different types of grounding, so to speak, and they say that the really problematic one is the grounding in the sense of referential competence, so linking to the world. The second claim is the fact that, so what we basically consider referential competence. The second claim is that language models do acquire inferential semantics competence from distributional statistics. So it's basically, it's not true they don't have meanings. They do have meanings. Its meanings is something that is intended to be inferential semantics and inferential meanings. This is, for instance, also the view that has been argued for by Stephen Piantadosi and Felix Hill in their paper in 2022, when they say that the meaning that the language models acquire corresponds to basically the role that concept plays in some greater mental theory. And they basically, adopt the conceptual role theory of the theory of concepts, in which basically, again, the idea is that the concepts are representation whose content is determined by their positions in a mental theory. And the third claim is the fact that basically text only, and this is basically the claim that which is argued for by Anders Søgaard, is that the text-only language models can be referential grounding, since there is, let's say, a near isomorphism between their semantic space and the perceptual and physical space. So since the semantic space that they learn can be isomorphic or near isomorphic to the perceptual and physical space, this means that basically grounded relations can be actually simply be encoded into the semantic space of these two models, of these two type of spaces, and simply the grounding consists in learning a mapping between these two spaces which are nearly isomorphic. And I think that this position, it's at least to me, reminds very closely of the symbol interdependence hypothesis also that Max Lowers argued for still in 2011. So the fact that actually, models like LSA or things like that, so distributional models, are grounded because grounded relations are actually encoded in language. And so basically there is, again, an isomorphism between these two levels. In my talk, I will mainly focus on the problematic aspect on the second claim. And I will actually argue that actually this assumption that the inferential semantic competence is what these models possess is actually not true, or at least is not true in the full sense of these terms. And it's still it's not true, as for instance under Søgaard and others, and also others claim that basically these models acquire a satisfactory inferential competence from distributional statistics. And I will present some data of a current work that we have been doing, focusing on a specific phenomenon, on semantic phenomenon, which is a meronymy, so part-whole relation. Because the part-whole relation is an important aspect of inferential competence. We know that we want to distinguish part-of relations, so the fact that, for instance, dogs has legs from hyperonymic relations or is relations or categorical informations, like the fact that the dog is a mammal and so on. And then it's also an aspect of the knowledge, semantic aspect, which is greatly studied in language models. It is important that what does it mean that to know meronymy? Well, knowing meronymy also entails, requires knowing its semantic properties, especially the fact that it's an asymmetric relation. So for us, the fact that if A is a part of B, then B is not typically part of A. Okay, exactly because A is a meronymy, A is a part and B is the wall to which this part belongs. So what we have been trying to investigate in language models and is exactly two questions. So do language models know the part of objects? And do language models know that the part whole relation is asymmetric, so to speak? And this is also part of a joint work with a PhD student of mine, Mattia Proietti, and I will present you some preliminary analysis and results that we've been got with doing the experiments on this topic. As data sources, we use the McRae feature norms that, as you might know, are a list of properties generated by humans to describe the meaning of concepts. And we extracted from the McRae norms all the features that had the structure and holonomy as a meronym. So, for instance, dog has legs, or bird has wings, and so on. Then we also extracted meronyms from ConceptNet, that, as you know, is another kind of huge ontology and semantic network generated by using human input, human speakers. And in that case, we took as holonyms all the concepts in the McRae norms and other concepts in the things databases, and we extract from ConceptNet all the part of relations that link these concepts to their parts. And with these extractions we obtained two datasets: the dataset from McRae, which contains 998 part-whole pairs, and the ConceptNet dataset that contains more than 1,000 part-whole pairs. Then we used two language models. We took the Llama 2 instruct model. You know that the instruct model means that the original language model has been fine-tuned with instruction tuning, and it is specialized for chatting, and so that's why we tested it via zero-shot prompting. Namely, we actually gave it a prompt with no examples to be of meronyms, meronymic pairs. And then we also used and made experiments with the non-instruct versions of Llama, and in this case it's just a basic pre-trained model, no fine-tuning for chat, and we tested with the 5-shot prompting. So basically, we also gave to the models 5 examples of meronymic pairs before asking them information about part-whole relations. And we actually tested with these models on 2 tasks: a question task, for which, and this is the prompt that we use for the question task. We actually designed this prompt by resorting to the, best practices that have been selected about prompting engineering nowadays. And basically, so we have an instruction. Your task is to answer the following questions. So you must answer strictly with yes or no. Then the question, is the X a part of the Y? And in that cases, we used a meronymic pair, a part-whole pair instead of X and Y. And interestingly and importantly, we also prompt the model with the swapped question. So we not only ask the model if is the X a part of the Y, and the expected answer is yes, but also is the Y a part of the X, and the correct answer is no, exactly because the meronymic relation is asymmetric. Then we have another version of this task in which, instead of a questions, we ask the models to validate a judgment. So ask whether a statement was true or false. The X, so they have to present with a statement. The X is a part of the Y, and the correct answer was true. And then again, we presented a model with a swap version, and the Y is a part of the X, and the correct answer was false. Now, in these cases, these are the results that we got in terms of accuracy. And you can see that results are pretty low, especially if you consider the global scope. In the sense, for instance, in the question task, the instruct llama model, in the original part whole questions, produces 77% of correct answers. But then when we presented the correct answers, the pairs that they were correctly recognized as pairs in the SWOT version, only in the 75% of the cases it answered correctly. So it says no. Okay. This means that if we consider a pair as being correctly recognized as a pair only when it recognized that the X is a part of Y, but also that Y is not a part of X, the global accuracy drops to 58% of the pairs. And with ConceptNet, we see that the amount of correct, fully recognized data and fully recognized pairs, it's even lower. Okay. So this means that, for instance, even if in these cases, for the 71% of the cases, it says yes, correctly, that X is a part of Y, when the sentence is, the pair is swapped, it doesn't recognize that it should answer no, because the pair has been swapped and the Y is not a part of X. And you can see in the judgment task, here the results are even lower. So for instance, in this case, answering true or false is even harder for these models, for this model. Now, if we look at the non-instruct version of the models, so the models which has not been fine-tuned, in general, the results are globally even lower than the instruction tuning. This means that the original, I mean, the positive answer that this model was able to produce were actually due to the instruction tuning. But if we look at the original co-occurrences in the model, so in the simple information that this model is able to acquire from the simple pre-training, we can see that the results are much lower. And notice that in these cases, we use 5-shot prompting. This means that in each task and each question, the model was also seeing some examples of true meronyms. Okay, so in these cases, it was help in some way. Of course, one possibility is that the model doesn't know some of these parts. Okay, so it can simply be that it doesn't, even though we know that a lot of these models have been trained on a huge amount of data, it can be that the model doesn't know these parts. So what we did was to perform a part generation task. So this time we asked the model to generate parts. Okay, so we use this prompt. Your task is to list the parts of a given object. You must only format the output as a comma-separated list, and we collected the answer. Okay, we use 872 holonyms, which was basically the conjunction of all the holonyms in the McRae and the concept datasets, and we obtained more than 5,500 generations from the models. These generations were all validated manually, and we see that we obtain a very high accuracy. Okay, so more than 92%, almost 93% of the pairs were valid meronyms. Okay, so, and interestingly, and you see that for each holonym, the model was producing an average of 5.5 meronyms. And notice that the model also produces a lot of new valid meronyms, many more than the ones available in the McRae concept dataset, because the intersection between the original meronym-holonym pairs and the new one is very small. So this means that the model knows a lot of parts. And so what we did, we said, okay, let's test these parts, let's test this model with its own parts. Okay, so what we did was to fed the model with its own generated data, replicating the first two tasks. Okay, so in order to be sure that these models that were, these were the exactly pairs that were produced by the model. And interestingly, still the results are very low. Notice that the model correctly recognizes the parts of pairs 78% of the time, and only 61% of the time, so the corrected items are also recognized that they are, the reverse relation does not hold. So again, if we combine these two scores, only for almost 45% of its own pairs, of its own parts are recognized correctly, and it's also recognized that the relation is fully asymmetric. Okay, and again, in a judgment statement, this knowledge, these results are even lower. So basically, what we can conclude that the model does not know the parts, does not know that the parts it generates are parts. Or, so to speak, this model generates things that we know that are parts, but it doesn't know that these things that it generates are parts, or doesn't know for these very same items the properties or the asymmetric property of parthood. And this is exactly one case of a phenomenon that West and others have called the generative AI paradox. Namely that these models, exactly because they are generative, they generate a lot of things that for us make sense, but then their understanding of the things that they generate is much less accurate. Then we did a last experiment which incorporated images. So we chose Llama because Llama is an open source model. It's not the top model overall. I mean, we know that the top model so far, the one which is usually considered to be with the top performance is GPT-4, but we know that it's a proprietary model, so it cannot. It's not an open source. But the GPT-4 is multimodal, so GPT-4 has also been trained with images. Now, in these cases, images do help. Okay, so in these cases, the images really augment in several cases, especially in the McRae datasets. There is a significant increase in the performance. But notice that in the concept net, still there is a big lag and a big gap with respect to the top expected performance. So again, with ConceptNet, only approximately 70% of the pairs, of the whole pairs, are correctly recognized in the sense of being correctly identifying the part of relation and the asymmetric nature of the relation. So basically, we can say that performance improves, but there is still a big gap, especially with ConceptNet. And another problem is that improvement is likely to be due not only to images. That's the problem. Because with respect to other models, we know that there has been a heavy fine-tuning of GPT-4, the details of which we don't really know so much about. So, I mean, we cannot be sure that, this improvement is only due or is all due to the multimodal nature of the data that's being used. But still, even if this model, it's really, the biggest and the top ones still, it struggles in many cases to cope and to understand the meronymic relation. So this example, the experiments, was aimed to show that basically, even for inferential knowledge, these models still struggle a lot and have very big gap in many cases with respect to the human one. Okay, and so, for instance, especially in this specific piece of inferential knowledge, which is a meronymic relation, especially text-only models still have a very big gap with respect to human knowledge and human inferential competence. And we think we think that these data are kind of consistent with the the argument that Kyle Mewald and others have exposed in their papers on language and thought in large language model, when they spoke about the good at language, good at thought fallacy, namely the idea and the fallacious idea that if an entity generates long coherent stretch of text like language models do, it must possess rich knowledge and reasoning capabilities. And actually, as you know, Mewald distinguished between formal linguistic competence, that is knowledge of linguistic rules and patterns, for instance, knowledge even to generate parts in a very nice form, as we did, from functional competence, which basically corresponds to what I've called inferential competence so far. And what they say, what Mewald and others argue, is the fact that the language models have an almost human-like formal competence, but still fall short on functional inference competence. And a similar argument is advanced by you, others in the group of Alison Gopnik, when they say that language models are a kind of cultural technology that only imitates human language production. And I think that those data about the discrepancy between productions of parts and understanding of what a part is, it's really symptomatic, and it's really a clear example of these dissociations between formal production or accurate language production and lack of full understanding. I would like to say that what I've called before the optimistic view about the symbol grounding problem being actually solved by language models is actually, at least for me, over-optimistic in that sense. In the sense that language models, like all sorts of distributional semantic models, only identify highly sophisticated distributional associations between linguistic expressions. But they really lack a semantic space which is organized in inferential terms or in terms of theories, like also Piantadosi and Hill argue. Because what a theory is not a simple associations. A theory is a structured network of events and entities that are linked by relation that specify their different functional role in the system. So if we want to depict the difference between an association space and a theory, we can do something like that. So the one at the left, it's something that is the association space of, for instance, car, that can be acquired by distributional model or by a language model. On the other hand, on the right, we have what we can call the theory about car, in which the different entities are also connected by specific different type of relations that link them to the target. And I would say that the optimistic view is over-optimistic also with respect to the third claim. So with respect to the possibility that the semantic space learned by text models is actually grounded in the strict sense of the term, because it's near isomorphic to the physical spaces. Because this near isomorphism presupposes two aspects, two things. First of all, the existence of a strong and systematic alignment, what we call iconicity, between linguistic and word structures. And secondly, that such correspondences, such alignments can be recovered by distributional spaces. Now, the problem is that the language is only partially aligned with the word. There are iconic structures, but these iconic structures are not the dominant part of language. There are a lot of disalignment between language and the word. And moreover, the fact that the distributional spaces lack structures, as we saw, then can also prevent them to align with the physical world besides limited domains. Okay, so for instance, the classical example is the possibility that the distributional space of colors is actually aligned or isomorphic with the physical perceptual spaces. So there are perhaps domains in which this isomorphism is stronger, is possible, but I would argue that this is only, of course, in limited domains, and this is the reason is exactly because of the lack of structures of truly semantic structure that distributional spaces have. And I will say that using multimodal data, like for instance the one used by GPT-4 and other multilingual model, might not be enough. And that's also witnessed by the fact that, for instance, multimodal language models also have difficulty in coping with a lot of relational aspects of images and language. Just to make a small example, very recent work on state-of-the-art multimodal language model have shown that these models have problems in understanding simple argument swapping in subject, verb object sentences. So they really have problems in identifying relational structures. Okay, but on the other hand, why these models, if there is no such alignment with the respect from distributional spaces and inferential dimensions, so from inferential, or if this alignment between distributional spaces and referential spaces is so partial, why these models anyway work so well under many respects? Well, I think it's interesting, and there is an interesting work which has focus on an aspect that I've not touched, but I think it's parallel to the ones that we have seen, for instance, for Meronym and so on. So, for instance, you and others have done a very systematic testing of large language models on pragmatic phenomena, like metaphors, understanding Rice maxims, indirect speech acts, irony, and so on. And as we see in these pictures, in this figure taken from their pair, in most of the cases, or at least in some phenomena, the human performance, the brown bar, is actually very close to the performance of the language model. So these models seem to have, in many cases, an almost human-like ability to understand in pragmatic phenomena. And well, what they say is, differently from other people who have claimed that these models have a kind of sparks of theory of mind, I mean, is the fact that it's not that this model reasoning. It's simply that there are some phenomena that solving which some pragmatic phenomena for solving which it's not necessary to mentalize. So it's basically it's enough to resort to surface linguistic forms in order to identify or to solve this kind of patterns. This means that, like for aspects of perceptions of the world, also for communicative intentions, there are some of them that being partially encoded in linguistic structures and co-occurrences, and also and these co-occurrences and these overlap between the linguistic forms and pragmatic intentions can be exploited by these models in order to solve this task. And perhaps humans do the same, so might also resort to surface statistics in order to cope or to solve a pragmatic task. So instead of the over-optimistic, I will advance, and then I'm also close to conclusion. I would say that, well, the magic of language models, also with respect to the semantics and pragmatic aspect, is just the magic of distributional learning. And I would say that, well, the real revolutions that these models have brought to us is the fact that with respect also to previous distributional semantic models, we have learned that the range of semantic and pragmatic aspects that language encodes and can be recovered from distributional statistics, it's far greater than we could ever imagine before. And also we have to take into account that the amount of data that these models need in order to identify this aspect, it's huge, and it's far greater than the humans ones. The second aspect is the fact that the humans too, just to quote Bender and Köhler, also can behave and do behave like stochastic parrots, in the sense that they also process language using shallow surface cues only. But the problem is that if humans can resort to distributional shortcuts to carry out language understanding, do not necessarily do only that. So that's why I will argue for a more realistic view on the symbol grounding problems for language models and on their capability, or their actual and present capability to address this problem. So the problem is that meaning, both inferential and referential aspects of meaning, can spring from statistical co-occurrence only for those cases of a true and direct overlap between distributional statistics taught and the world. The problem is that instead of isomorphism, or even near isomorphism, I think that the more realistic pictures is this one. So there is an overlap between the distributional semantic space and the physical space, and perhaps the inferential semantic space. But this overlap is, under many respects, quite limited. And there are many aspects of these relations that still remain completely detached and not being solved, or perhaps solvable, question mark, by distributional statistics only. For instance, in the examples of the meronym task, we see an example of the lack of overlap between these two aspects. So basically, only some aspects of the inferential semantic space concerning, for instance, meronyms can be truly identified, or can be really captured by the distributional semantic spaces, while there are probably a lot of aspects of the inferential semantic space that cannot be really represented by the distributional semantic space. So it's not true that this. So that's why I would say that the symbol grounding problem is something that there is something more, or the simple, or let's say the symbol grounding problem is not only about grounding, in the sense that the major problem for today's language model is not so much about their lack of referential grounding, but the very type of knowledge that they extract from linguistic data. And I put knowledge between quotes exactly because I think that there is a big distinction between the knowledge they extract and the human knowledge under many respects. So in this sense, I really agree with those like Melanie Mitchell and others that claim that, I mean, perhaps language models have a different type of understandings than humans, or at least extract knowledge, extract information, or extract knowledge that can be of different types from the truly human one. And it's an interesting question, how big is this overlap? But they actually have a very different type of knowledge from what we can call human inferential knowledge. So again, it's not true that that their semantic space is an inferential space. They mainly identified very sophisticated associative links. So in this sense, I think it's always, I mean, I always agree with those that say, I mean, language models are language models. So they extract the distributional probabilities that allow them to learn a lot of statistical associations that in any case, unless for quite limited cases, they do not correspond to structured theories. And since they don't have, their semantic space is not a theory, they do not even have theories of the world, which might allow them to require or to acquire true referential competence of the world. What I mean, why I said a true referential competence? Because there are also those who claim that basically well, they have a kind of derivative competence, derivative referential competence because of, let's say, historical relations. You know, since they've been exposed to language that humans use to refer to the world, so there is a kind of causal relations, of historical relations that link them to the reference. It can be like that, but acquiring true referential competence means really having a theory of the world that can be derived from distributional statistics and that allow them to, again, to have a true referential competence in linking the elements to the world in a direct way. And I think that this is the lack of this is not only because the lack of multimodal data, but the type of the knowledge they extract. And this is also the reason why, as I said, adding multimodal data, like for instance images and so on, can help, can improve their ability to look at the world, but it's not, does not suffice to solve the symbol grounding problem for these models. It is exactly this lack of a semantic space which is truly a structure in the theories of the world, theories of the mind, that perhaps also limit the possibility of language model to fully address the simple grounding problem. That's it. Thank you.
That was absolutely excellent. We're already having questions being asked. Could I ask you to unshare so we can see?
Yes. Yes. Let me. Okay.
So I'll just want to use the chairman's prerogative to ask the first question. And I agree with just about everything that you said. So I'm going to say something critical, but not because I believe it, but because I just want to hear your answer to it. Okay.
Yeah.
About the meronomy and the part-whole symmetry, could it be that in their failures, these language models are actually showing that they're smarter than we are? And I'll tell you why. Your notion, and most people's notion of meronomy and part-whole relations are sort of folk psychology. If you consider things, I'm sure it's been raised to you, if you consider, for example, Russell's paradox about sets that are members of themselves or not members of themselves, those are formally, structurally analogous to part-whole relations. And I bet you, although I'm not a physicist or a geometer, I bet you in geometry you have cases where you can literally get violations of that asymmetry. So maybe because they're in this abstract world of formal abstractions, they're just seeing the abstractions and they're seeing possibilities that we're not seeing because we're biased by our grounding.
Well, yeah, that could be an answer. But on the other hand, okay, that would be the possibility that you say, I mean, they have a different kind of quotes intelligence, right? That's the point.
No. There is more latent in distributional data than we're taking for granted.
Okay, yes. On the other hand, for me, it's quite striking, right? The fact that, as I told you, first of all, they produce parts, but they don't even recognize their own parts that they produce. Okay. So I think that this productions versus understanding asymmetry is quite revealing, right? Because in a way, you can produce language by imitation. You cannot understand language by imitation. Okay, so that's a basic difference. Okay, in a way, this is the essence of the parrot, right? So you know that the parrot can generate language, but you're not sure whether it has understood what you meant. You simply recognize it produces forms. So that's, I guess, it's the essence of those models. Then one possibility, which we have not explored, and let's agree with you, there could be cases in which perhaps this asymmetry does not hold. Okay, so it's not the relations between a leg or I don't know, a dog's and a leg, but there can be also maybe situations in which something can be a part of something which is itself a part of a things which is similar to the other one. I don't know. We can see. There might be cases like that we want to test that we have not considered. But I think that the failures that they do really, for me, underlines a lack of basic semantic relations. And also a semantic the reasons why we chose meronymy is also because meronymy is something which is on the inferential side, but also strictly related to the grounding side. Okay, because a lot of these elements were concrete. For instance, all the McRae norms are concrete, contain concrete entities. So all of them probably are, and perhaps this is also the reason why, for instance, GPT-4 in the McRae datasets performs significantly well than the ConceptNet. Okay, because in the McRae norms, all the entities are concrete, so they are very common nouns, they're basic concepts, so it's likely that they have experienced a lot of images of these objects. So I don't know.
Let me suggest that you did an ingenious experiment. I agree with what you did. It was a terrific choice to use meronymy, and the results are splendid. And I don't believe in the criticism that I just made. Anyway, I want to pass to the next.
Oh, well, but I can tell you one thing, because an experiment that we have been, another investigation that we have been doing, it's not ready to be shown yet, but just to give you an idea of a similar. Okay, we wanted to investigate causal relations. So whether these language models distinguish between true causal relations between events and simple temporal precedence. Okay, and we first, we as linguists, we divided we selected the sentence that we consider to be true causal pairs and pairs of events that, on the other hand, for us, didn't contain any type of causal relation. Okay, these models agreed on our classifications quite a lot. On the other hand, then we asked we also presented the subjects with these models, with crowdsourcing, asking to identify whether two events were causally related or not. And interestingly, the subjects identified causal relations many more times than we did. So in most of the pairs that we consider to be simply linked by temporal relations, people were also identifying causal relations. Okay. And so that's maybe, and I think that in this case is perhaps, I mean, we were right in the sense our analysis were more probably, I mean, subjects have a tendency to put the causal relations everywhere, or to be more prone to identify, to link to events with a causal link. And indeed, this was a case in which, for instance, let's say the language models agreed more with a linguist expert or with a set of linguist experts rather than the crowd of people. Okay.
Okay, let me pass now to Jean-Pierre. Go ahead. Sorry to keep you waiting so long.
Oh, no. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Stephen, and grazie mille, Alessandro. Great talk, very convincing and very clear analysis of imitation. So my comment and question is that you showed that if you improve the LLM, for instance, using ChatGPT-4, the error is getting smaller and smaller. But my expectation is that there will always remain some error, and the foundation is that it's based on the statistical probabilistic nature of the inference and the training. And so when you talked about this, the formal or structural theories, that is, you need to have exact relationships between concepts, and which doesn't work. I mean, which a purely statistical foundation, which is the based on correlation and cannot incorporate. So my guess is that there will be less and less errors, but there will still be some obvious errors for people like for human beings. I mean, and not only us, but the machine which can do formal reasoning. So of course, the next step is the integration of formal reasoning mechanisms with and mapping between the lexem, which are learned, and concepts and reasoning about it. But so well, it's not really a question, just a comment, and if you agree with me.
Yes, I totally agree in the sense that you see, GPT-4, or moreover, is not purely statistic. Okay, so there is a lot of engineering and human correction there, which I guess does a lot of the work there in getting the model even more precise. But I think it's revealing the difference between the extraction and the non-extraction version. Because in the non-extraction version, you simply use purely statistics, okay, purely co-occurrence. And you see that there, I mean, it's very poor. Okay, but even the extraction ones, where perhaps, at least they may not be instructed in solving meronymy, but they've been instructed in providing answers and so on, so in chatting, and so they're being more prone to prompt. I mean, still you see the gap is really huge, much more than we expected, so to speak. And so, yes, I think that, again, providing more data, whatever, might, again, and there is also then, I mean, again, then of course, I mean, I'm talking with the psychologist, right? So then, okay, my question is always, okay, but what these models that receive so much input can really tell with respect to knowledge with this formed by so much less input that we do. But still, okay, we can keep on increasing the input, but I believe that the problem lies in exactly on the discrepancy between formal inference and simple associations. And we are talking about a simple meronymy, which is a very simple relation. So as I told you, I mean, we're not talking about complex, I don't know, causal structures, or like, for instance, the one that Alison Gopnik has in mind with when we talks about theories, right? So it's very simple. Okay, and already in these simple things, the model crashes quite dramatic, I would say.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad that the next question. You have more, Jean-Pierre? Go ahead.
No. Just adding some other example, which was showed by Marcus. I forgot. But anyway, just that it learned to say that subject A is son of or mother of subject B, but it cannot deduce that B is the son of subject A. This kind of simple limitation, it's another example. And I really enjoyed that you work with simple relation, but fundamental relation like part-word hierarchy, and to show the point. Thank you. Thank you again.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre. I'm glad that the next question is from Arthur, because I think that there's something that, if there's anything that can be said that's critical, is that you give some short shrift to the sensory motor iconic features, not just iconic is oversimplifying, the sensory motor features of sensory motor grounding. And I think Arthur is sort of the spearhead in that.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and even more thank you to Alessandro for the really excellent talk. Yeah, very clever way of getting at this. But my question really is more along the lines of Jean-Pierre's question, and it's, you demonstrated for us that the current versions of these models have a hard time with part whole, but I didn't see a clear argument that increasing the power of the models, increasing from going from hundreds of billions of parameters to trillions of parameters, that they'll never be able to solve part whole relations like humans do, as well as humans do. And I believe, like you do, that that's the case, but I didn't hear a clear argument that increasing the power of the models will not allow them to overcome the data that you've produced.
In the sense that, yes, I didn't provide an argument for that. Yes, I agree. That's really, I think that in a way, you see, for instance, GPT-4 is already something quite bigger than Llama, okay? And as I told you, there is an increasing, it's without doubt. But if you think about the concept net data, as I said, I mean, the gap is really high. Although the comparison is really not fair because, I mean, it's like, let's to compare a Ferrari, which you don't have never opened the hood because they didn't allow you to open the hood and you don't know how they build the Ferrari. And compare with I don't know, with another machine that on the other hand you have been able to assemble yourself, or maybe you can twitch a little bit and so on. So the comparison is not fair, but still, again, I mean, that's why we wanted to compare with GPT-4. We said, okay, that's the top of the class. I mean, okay, we can expect the things to grow again. We know that we are almost touching the limit in the sense that people are also claiming that basically they are almost using all the amount of data that are there. So, I mean, we couldn't really increase the amount of data so much. And if you go from Llama to GPT-4, and yes, there is a better improvement, but still, I mean, but still there is a lot of errors, and especially that's what really struggles me is the fact that there is a lot of errors in the swapping, right? So they can also be good in one direction, but when you ask them to be good in both directions, as we do, really that's where the trick is appears, right? That's the point. So yes, we don't have an argument for that. I think it is also very difficult analytical argument to provide. Okay, so we cannot provide really an argument only based on. I mean, there are people who say, okay, but we know that size does matter. So I mean, if we increase everything, the size that will be really the case. So I simply think that this is not a scientific argument, neither pro, neither against. Because we don't even know whether they will allow. I mean, we know that there has been an improvement, but in increasing the size. But we saw that a lot of these models still made a lot of errors on these very simple inferences. So,
yeah, thank you. I think the challenge for me is to pick up where Stephen started. When he introduced me, and that's to come up with, if not an analytic argument, at least a strong argument based on sensory motor grounding, and but I'm not there yet, hopefully.
No,
yeah. The group.
Well, what I, as you know, also in our book on distributional semantics, we said, well, you know, if we have these multimodal models, well, that's a way to address the simple grounding problem. And when you came to PISA, you said, well, that's not enough. And I have come to believe that this is true, in the sense that adding images or videos, whatever you want, yes, of course, you provide data that are a kind of icon of external reality, but still the way these models learn from this data is the same, so statistical associations. And that's the problem. So that's the core problem, okay? Because if you think about the way all the multimodal model are trained, which is basically by contrastic learning, so this basically amounts to associating strings of captions with elements extracted from images. And that's, again, the same things. That's not a referentially grounded space. It's in associations between associations, but nothing else. So in that sense, I've come to agree with you that having let's say, I mean, I think that we've done a very, I mean, with respects to what we are doing with symbolic models, at least now with vectors, we can combine these things. So that's a way to an improvement, because we have a common representation format, while before that was not the case. But still, I don't think that going multimodal with this type of language model is an answer to the language model symbol grounding problem. So,
okay, thank you very much. Let me point out that the three questioners so far, including me and the speaker, have been not optimists. Okay, and now the next questioner will be an optimist. However, he is also a skeptic, because he's saying he is optimistic, but he is not happy with the amount of information we have to go by yet on the basis for the optimism. Stephen Hansen.
Wow, Stephen, that was an amazing introduction. I feel both positive and negative at the same time. I love it. Okay. So, Alessandro, I enjoyed the talk. I think you're basically right about symbol grounding. I think you made some really important points here. On the other hand, I have a real problem with the description of what chatbots or LLMs or GPTs are doing. And I do think Arthur's correct. If you go to 900 billion connections, GPT-4, which I interact on a daily basis and program with and, you know, do lots of fun things with, it does seem to be able to construct all kinds of causal theories about the world and the things that you're doing. I think part of the problem here is the language that I've heard you use in this context. So the first thing that's sort of, I think, dated is associationism. Another thing is this co-occurrence statistics and distributional semantics. These are all things that, I mean, I worked on a language program back in the 90s called Parsnip, which learned from the Brown corpus, essentially syntactic structure. And Judy Cagle and I did a sort of an linguistic analysis of what it knew and what it didn't know. And so, and of course, what we were attacked by Fodor and everybody saying, "Oh, you're just doing distributional semantics and it's just associationism." So what makes you think? So I'm saying this is brand new, and I'll say this again. I've said it again in this forum, but I'll say it again. Nobody has any clue what the actual computational structure of the GPTs, of the LLMs are. They just don't. Knowing the process that you're predicting the next word, in fact, is kind of totally insufficient to construct what you get back. There is a recent paper showing that the attention heads as autoregressive actually implement a small constraint recurrent, an RNN, a recurrent neural network. And we know RNNs are really good, especially some of the similar, like Elman nets, could learn finite state machines very easily, and you could extract a finite state machine. I did this many times out of but these things are not distributional semantics. They're not statistics in any sense that we understand. In fact, any statistical friends I have would just go, where's the linearity? Where's the Gaussianity? Where's the simple structure? There is none. Okay, and then we have other people like Ellie Pavlak, who's been showing that the attention heads produce various kinds of circuits that look similar to what's in the prefrontal cortex of humans. Yeah. This she just published a paper on that. So I think the story's out in terms of what we can actually conclude, and using this, I think, straw man argument that we're looking at co-occurrence statistics or any of that language from the 90s is just a non-starter. So what is it you think, if that's what you believe, is happening inside of these language models?
Well, I think that these language models do very much similar things, although in a very more sophisticated things that were doing much simpler models like that were hype some years ago, like Word2Vec and others, right? So these basically encode in an implicit way co-occurrence statistics, although in a very sophisticated way.
No, they don't. I'm sorry, I just have to stop you. No, they don't. They don't. We know they don't. There's nothing about statistics in here. They're not taking
statistics in the sense
word co-occurrences and constructing a context-free grammar. They're not. That's not what's happening. So I just reject your premise. Your initial assumption is just not true. That they're not. There's no distributional structure at all in this that makes any sense. And I think
Steve. Okay, hold it. Let the answer take place. Go ahead.
Well, the answer is fine as long as we stay on track with my question is, what do you think's inside of a GPT if it isn't co-occurrence statistics?
Go ahead and answer, Alessandro.
Well, okay, I will not use the word statistics, okay, in order to be clear on that.
Thank you.
What they actually encode is the, let's say, informations about the likely context with which these words tend to co-occur. Okay? That's, I think, it's basically what they encode. They encode they use very long stretches of context, but what the attentions models does when they look at the embeddings, now it's even difficult to look at the embeddings in things like GPT. But I've looked a lot at the embeddings and the internal representations in BERT. Okay, so let's say in a generation of these language models, which now seems to be a little bit out of date, but it's still a language models. Okay, with transformer-based language models. And actually, what you do in the BERT embeddings, you can really see informations about the context in which these words occur, so that you can really sort out which are the typical, aspects also of meanings that depends on the different contexts in which they appear. And they encode a lot of semantic information, side by side, syntactic information, and so on, which depends on the context in which they've been observed. So and they, on the other hand, they tend to encode and to have a strong bias towards the frequency of the context that we've been observed into. And that's why perhaps wrongly, as you said, I use the word statistics because they don't encode explicit statistics, but they tend to encode a lot of information about the context in which have been observed. And that's, I think, it's the essence of distributional semantics. That's why I've always considered these models to be a very powerful, let's say, development of distributional semantics. Then, of course, they've been now used in many more different ways than before, not only for semantics at all, but I think that they are part of the same principle that was, for instance, for Word2Vec, which was, or even before previous models. I don't know whether I answered to you, but I think that's basically.
No, I think the word context I love a lot better, and I do believe there are contexts, and the little bit of representational analysis I've done on GPT 3.5, which I get some access to through some OpenAI people, and talking about this, there's like 50 million clusters that you can identify on the top that, you're right, look like contextual structure. Now, the real question is, if you think of that as a semantic memory and you come rolling into it through an attractor space and you hit it, what then? How do you make well-formed sentences? How do you follow any queries in a way that really just isn't, some kind of latent semantic, factor analysis where you're probing? That's not what's happening here. These things are forming, very clear reasoning responses. Now, whether they're doing reasoning or not, I wouldn't want to say, because I personally don't know what's inside of them. And it's scary as hell what's going on. But once you get to the context part, then, if it's distributional, then all you're saying is there's some probability distributional space of some sort that's multimodal and has a lot of clusters, and you can come into it in some hyperdynamical way and find things. Yes, but then what? Now, that's where I have hope that people like Ellie, who's doing this very careful analysis, are finding circuit structures, not statistics, circuits, computer programs inside the thing that it just wrote in connection space. And by the way, GPT-4 doesn't have much engineering. It has a lot of filtering and a lot of punishment to make the thing obsequious so that it doesn't offend some millennial somewhere. But other than that, it doesn't have any kind of there's no engineering. The scale is very important. So something happened between 90 billion weights and 900 billion weights, and something else is going to happen very dramatically. I predict somewhere around 2 trillion weights. The human brain has about 100 trillion. Okay. But on the other hand, the human brain is highly structured. I don't know how highly structured this thing. No one does. There's a kind of an MRI you need to do of these things, and it's impossible.
Well, can I ask
Steve is optimistic. Go ahead.
Yes, no, but I wish you were. No, but for instance, going back to your notion of context, right? So, for instance, we did a research as linguists, where, for instance, in the word embeddings of verbs, there were informations about the semantic properties of the so-called Dautus proto-roles. So, for instance, if in a verb like kill, the model in the vector of kill, there was information about the fact that the subject was agentive and the object was more patient-like, while in a verb like die, the agent is not agentive, but has more a kind of patient meaning and so on. And these models do have this information. And these models...
That's amazing.
Yeah, these models have this information because these models have this information. I mean, we did some experiments with BERT and with GPT-2, which is our, again, smaller model, and they have this type of information. But, interestingly, they have a lot of information about, for instance, animacy, because animacy is a tract, is a feature which is very much encoded in language. And so there is a clear distinction between animate subjects and inanimate entities. And so this is something which is very much connected with the distributional properties. But when you investigated causal properties, so the fact that a verb like kill changes or causes something to change, this information which was much less encoded in these models. So let's come back again to what I try to argue in my talk. So there are aspects of meaning that are more encoded in distributional co-occurrences, and that can be recovered easier from these models, but others they are not, or they are much weaker encoded.
Well, of course, you realize that if you look at the human brain and you simply do a very simple machine learning classification on, say, hippocampal areas and temporal lobe, the first distinction you pull out, and you've shown the pictures or something, the first distinction that pops out is animacy and inanimacy. That's the very thing. And in fact, that's the first thing that children learn. Yeah. So learning frequency, I mean, you're right. Humans are really good with frequency, and apparently having enough data that has some kind of structure, not co-occurrences, but end tuples. I mean, we're talking about multiple. If you want to talk about, end tuple statistics, that might be something I could get into, but I don't understand how that would work either in terms of how it goes back to generating things about animacy or inanimacy just from the data. So, and you got to realize, of course, humans are learning from the data in the same way, maybe.
Well, I think this looks like a point on which we can, first of all, thank you for this, and also to say that we can agree to disagree about these things. Steve's plea for more information on how it's done, you share. You want to know more about how it's done as well. Whether one styles oneself as an optimist or a non-optimist under these circumstances is rather a subjective matter. The points that have been made have been valid, and I'm eager to hear you again in June.
Sorry, it was a question for.
No, it was it was actually, we're wrapping it up. We've run out of time.
Okay.
So I'm just saying that I look forward to, I hope we can look forward to you again in June.
Oh, yes, that will be a pleasure. I will be a pleasure. I will join you with pleasure. Yes.
Okay. So thank you. Thank all of you. And next week, who is actually is our next week's speaker here as well? I don't have it in front of me anyway. I think it's King is speaking next week, and then anyway, until next week, keep on staying optimistic if you're optimistic.
Okay.
Pessimistic if you're pessimistic.
No, thanks for the very nice discussion. It was really amazing to meet all of you. Really, thank you very much.